Welcome back to the Imaginary Gallery. It's TJ here again, and we are still discussing Sandra Brown's book, which I show every time. I won't even repeat the name, except person. Anyway, this is a serious subject which kind of ties in with, well, I guess they're all serious, but this one especially, because it actually ties into some of the other videos I've already made with the narcissist abuse or narcissistic abuse and other cluster B videos. But this one is the chapter regarding the abusive or violent person. And she starts off her chapter with stating, here he is, the one we all fear, the one too many men or women have met, dated, and married. He or she's the reason we track statistics on domestic violence and homicide. The fact that he or she continues to succeed at what he or she does demands that we examine the phenomenon of domestic abuse, not only in terms of behavior, but perhaps more importantly in terms of what the targets or victims are missing in the beginning that causes them to continue getting involved and staying involved with such a person. Because without victims, these violent people wouldn't have much of a career in violence. Well, Sandra Sundar, she calls this character Victor the Viper. And she starts off just telling you that people who physically assault partners are not the only kind of abusive people out there that qualify as dangerous. As you'll see from one of her stories she has, there are many behaviors that are abusive, some less obvious than others, which, there we go with the covert. Covert. And she's telling us that thousands of victims, I wish I rarely use that word, at least with the narcissist videos, it's more like target, but we'll just go along with Sandra. Thousands of people die every day at the hands of violent people with whom they were intimately involved. And she says it's estimated that over 80% of homicides against partners are perpetuated by other partners or spouses, which causes us to wonder how many homicides could occur in spite of the red flags people should have. The answer, she states, is that many of these targets or victims who are seriously injured or murdered in episodes of domestic violence are well aware of the partner's tendency towards violence, but still do not permanently separate from him or her. They either tried and the partners pursued them, or they did not try and ended up seriously injured or dead. If there ever was an argument for respecting and responding to your red flags, the possibility of getting involved with a violent person is. And this next part reminds me of a video I've already made. She stole my material. But no, she says, very few relationships start with a smack on date number 1. If they did, the smacker would rarely get a date number 2. Violence in a relationship occurs once the relationship's developed. It begins as a progression of boundary violations that are left unaddressed. If early on a partner is allowed to be verbally degrading, emotionally inconsiderate, or physically abusive, and the partner stays with him, she has sent the message about what she is willing to tolerate or he is willing to tolerate. Silence is acceptance to a violent mind, which is a very important point. Even if you verbalize your concerns, staying equals consent in the violent person or evil person's eyes. The target is training the evil one how to treat her or him. Many domestic violence shelters allege that some partners continue to abuse because they can. That is, they get away with acts of violence because the partner doesn't report them to the police, or the partner drops the case and does not prosecute, or stays, or goes back. Although the abuse may begin early in the relationship with verbal and emotional inappropriateness, it eventually grows to dangerous and violent expressions of power and control. Just as addictions are progressive, so is violence. She's right. But anyway, violent people have issues with power and control. Why or how these people come to acquire these deadly skills is widely debated within the mental health community, but it is at least agreed upon that one of the main issues is the inability to have an equality-based relationship. They, meaning the violent one, they have to be top dog. When their power and control are threatened by your individuality or your desires, abuse or violence is a likely outcome. These people were more likely raised in households in which violence was a predominant form of communication. So they learned that the solution to what displeased them was violence. These people have other issues as well. In more than 50% of cases, violent people also have drug and or alcohol issues. Violence plus addiction equals possible death. For you, for him or her, for anyone else around. Violence will most likely be compounded when drugs or alcohol are in the picture. Now, as she says, as mentioned above, some of these people are the byproduct of violent childhoods. This means there's a huge possibility of them having emotional problems or mental illness associated with the violence they experienced at the hands of their parents, step-parents, or other caregivers. Some forms of mental illness are intimately connected to the potential for violent behavior. Those diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and sometimes schizophrenia can turn violent. Recognizing the connection between mental illness and violence in no way excuses any form of violence. It only helps us look more closely at the potential for danger that mental illness can bring or add to a relationship. Here she goes with that word. These combo pack men and women bring with them complicated histories that probably include learned violence, childhood abuse, and violence, a dysfunctional upbringing, active addictions, possible trauma-related disorders, and mental health issues. Trying to find a single source for their violence is like pulling a loose thread on a tapestry. Where it will lead is hard to tell. Now, those of us who date these ticking time bombs may never know the reasons behind their violence. Sticking around to find out why the partner is so out of control may cost you your life. Sandra says she doesn't know how badly she thinks she needs to know the why of the sad life, but it could turn out to be knowledge that comes at a mighty heavy price. Now, this is a very interesting part. What constitutes abuse? Many people miss the signs of abuse, especially if you're looking for abuse in the form of a physical assault. Rarely does it begin so abruptly or noticeably. Violence begins with smaller acts of violation and grows into larger patterns of behavior that can span several categories of abuse. Now she's going to go through a brief description of some of the types of abuse you should be aware of. Verbal abuse. That includes yelling, calling you names, threatening you, degrading you, swearing at you, and intimidating you with language and volume. Emotional abuse, which includes controlling and dominating you by not allowing you to make your own choices, telling you how to dress and behave, or whom you can or can't talk to. Put downs that keep you captive and uncertain that you could make it on your own. Criticizing you, which ruins your self-esteem, so you will lack the confidence to leave. Unfounded jealousy. Acts of violence towards inanimate objects just to scare you, such as punching a wall or throwing things. Publicly humiliating you, isolating you from others so they do not know what's going on, and so you will not be able to get the help that you need in order to leave. Spiritual abuse, which is making fun of or criticizing your spiritual beliefs, trying to dictate or control your relationship with a higher power and how that relationship is expressed in your life, or using a distorted interpretation of Scripture to justify dominating you because, if it's a woman, women are supposed to submit to their husbands. And yes, there are people that believe this and use it as an excuse to be evil to their wives. Financial abuse consists of your partner controlling all the money as a form of controlling you, so you have no resources with which to leave. Concealing assets or shared money so you cannot leave, or so you must be dependent on the evil one and go to him or her for all of your needs. Keeping you impoverished so you don't aspire to anything more than what you have with him or her. And blowing money to demonstrate power and to leave little or none for you. Now this one's common. Physical abuse. Any act of violence such as hair pulling, choking, hitting, kicking, slapping, pushing, restraining or holding you so you cannot leave, biting, using a weapon, locking you up so you cannot flee, and abduction of you and or your children. That's all she says about that one. But sexual abuse includes any form of physically attacking the sexual areas of your body, forcing unwanted acts of sex on you, rape, sodomy, and forcing you to watch sexual acts or pornography against your will. And the last one she lists is system abuse, which results from your partner, who's violent, violating and ignoring restraining orders or any other court orders that he's or she's required to follow, lying about you to the police or to social service agencies in order to have your children removed from you or have services discontinued that would help you leave, violating child custody arrangements, not paying child support so that you fail financially, and not showing up for court-mandated treatment for batterers. Now, who do these people seek? Well, it should be obvious that those of us who are high on the list for abusive or violent partners, it should be obvious that those of us who will stay are high on the list for abusive or violent partners. Having their power cake and eating it too is very appealing to these dangerous creatures. She's not saying this to make light of the very complicated reasons for why some of us will stay. She's saying it to point out from the other one's perspective why someone like you or me, why our willingness to stay is appealing. A partner who's abused, who believes an abuser when he or she says it's your fault, he or she will change, never do it again, will go to counseling, will go to church, and only does it because you make him or her, or that the abuse is being done because the partner truly needs or deserves it. Well, this kind of person is the top choice for a violent person. Sadly, there are plenty of people who believe these types of statements and are still waiting through the slaps and kicks to see if this person will actually act on the pathological promises made. Well, she and I are here to tell you and save you some time. He isn't. A target who is satisfied with a good boy or good girl makeup tactics, such as being treated to a new piece of jewelry, a dinner out, or a vacation so you'll forget the horrors of last week, is another candidate for an abusive partner. When pretty words or pretty things can undo the damage inflicted by these acts of violence, this dangerous creature has found a comfort zone. Beat and buy. Targets who come from abusive homes are already trained in the ways of violent and pathological people. They know the way it all plays out and are familiar with rules of the game. Low self-esteem in a partner is an attractive quality for an abusive person, as is a victim stance when it comes to the way he or she perceives him or herself. A worldview that says, I can't get out, this is just the way it is, helps the target to adjust to the abuser's world. Now, someone who's already had a history of getting involved with violent people is also a good choice for this type of person. The longer and the more often you've dated abusive people, the better trained you are for the new one. The new violent person in your life will have very little tweaking to do to get you and keep you up to speed. Some prefer to think they merely wandered into violent relationships, rather than realizing that their partners know what kind of partner they need in order to avoid changing. You are way beyond a coincidence. Your convenience in the abuser's life is not a mistake on the abuser's part. Now, why are these people successful? Abusive and violent people are successful for many reasons, most of which have to do with their being very good at what they do and repeatedly getting away with it. But we targets aren't excused from being observant. Just because certain pathological people are skilled at finding, dating, harming, and sometimes killing partners, nor are we excused from how we respond to signs of dangerousness and pathology in our potential partners. We can minimize the lessons we stand to learn if we simply say, it's not that I was unobservant, it's that he was or she was that good. Maybe that's one way of looking at it from the grave. But she thinks that there are other ways of looking at it that can help us see in the here and now. The existence of abusive and violent people provides the best reason for learning why dangerous people have been successful in your life and in other people's lives. Just how good are your observation skills? As with other categories of dangerous people, we can miss the signs of abusive or violent people because we don't think we would ever end up in a relationship with one of them. We, people, are snookered by these people because they're not looking for the signs and symptoms of abuse and violence. Whether or not he's good at what the abuser does, is no excuse for your being unobservant and then responding positively to him. An abusive partner obviously starts out in the relationship, at least briefly, a little differently from how he or she ends up. Really? Oh dear, I've experienced this one many, many, many times. The person is charming, attentive, fun, talkative. Whatever attracts you to him or her, that's what he or she is. Compare and contrast this with how this person is as the relationship's ending. By then, you may not even recognize a flicker of who it once was. But it had to be good in the beginning for you to get involved. That's how they do it. This person's successful when the targets cling to the image of how it was and forget how it currently is. Wanting to get back to that love and feeling that was fake, by the way, it can keep you glued to a dead-end relationship for years. Dating a violent person is never the time to forget about all the bad times that came after the good times. This creature is successful because many partners violate their own boundaries about what they will tolerate. They fail to live by the one-strike rule, one hit, one fear-inducing gesture, one episode of ugly and degrading language, one anything that causes us to wonder if the person could get violent. And this person, we should be out of there. Instead, too many of us will say, if you hit me one more time, and draw a line in the sand that turns out to be meaningless. It gets erased. Next time, again, says, I mean it. If you hit me even one more time, Well, 5 years later, the line in the sand has been long forgotten, perhaps by both of them. Domestic violence shelters have proliferated since the 1970s. There are resources and pathways out of violent relationships for all victims. There are so many resources and so many forms of assistance that a lack of help is no longer a valid reason for why people will stay in violent relationships. Help exists in the form of emergency safe houses, transitional housing, job training, counseling, and more. Everything you need to get out and survive on your own is available now. These dangerous people are also successful because some of us are so embarrassed to have ended up with an abusive person that we'd rather try to hide it than expose it and get out. We often linger in these deadly environments out of fear of failure and exposure. Finally, violent partners continue to be violent because even if someone leaves, they don't always prosecute. This is a huge issue for those involved in prosecuting abusers and in helping victims of domestic violence. It also is a huge issue for the people that these creatures will date in the future. Whether or not you return to the relationship, at least have a paper trail for your sister or brother in the dating world who may date this person in the future. Let there be court documents, police reports, and jail sentences to warn this person in case a background check is performed. Give this sister or brother